This is lecture 11, Revolutions, and I'm going to begin with a prayer from the Schleswig-Holsteinische Kirchen Agenda of 1797, German Church prayer book. May the Lord bless us with wisdom, with courage and strength to do his will. May the Lord keep our souls pure, our consciences at peace, our hearts content. May the Lord grant us a portion of his blessing in this life, and one day the higher joys of eternal life. Amen. So, starting with the American Revolution in 1775, a wave of revolutions spread across the Western world. We'll look at each of, not every single revolution, but we'll look at these various revolutions in turn. And what's important to note is that not all these revolutions were the same. They emerged from different strands of the Christian tradition, and they were shaped by different strands of the Enlightenment, and they led to different types of relationships between Christianity and liberalism, or Christianity and the Revolution. They were also more or less radical. The American Revolution was the first, and it had widespread Protestant support. To understand it, you need to remember what we said a few lectures ago about the Protestant interest. Protestants had come to see Britain as the bastion of Protestant liberty against Roman Catholic tyranny. Yet, similar to what had happened in the Puritan Revolution of the 1600s and the Glorious Revolution, Protestants became convinced that their religious and political rights as Englishmen were being threatened. You'll recall that all through English history, the most foundational political right, going all the way back to the Magna Carta, was the right not to be taxed without your consent. Protestants in America, even before the Revolution, had increasingly argued that their religious liberties depended on their political liberties. If their political liberties were taken away, their religious liberties would be taken soon after. Recall that Protestant dissenters actually had far more freedom in America than they did at Britain in most cases. Virginia would be the exception. But a series of events following the French and Indian War in 1763, where the British finally drove the French out of North America, convinced colonists that Britain was actually not the protector of their liberties, but the threat to their liberties. When Britain passed the Quebec Act in 1774, establishing the Catholic Church in Canada, which Britain had just conquered from France in 1763, this was seen as a grave threat to Protestantism and even a betrayal, an established Catholic Church under British rule. There were also fears that Britain would strengthen the Anglican Church in America by appointing a bishop. Up to this point, there was no Anglican bishop in America. And remember, many Protestants viewed the Anglican Church as being sort of potentially crypto-Catholic. In fact, even many Anglicans in America feared this. When the war did break out in 1775 in Puritan Massachusetts, it was seen as a defensive war. In a series of measures, Britain had attempted to tax the colonies without their consent. When Massachusetts and other colonies protested or used civil disobedience to overturn these tax policies, including famously destroying tea by dumping it into Boston Harbor in the Boston Tea Party, Britain sent troops to enforce law and order. But colonists saw this sending of troops as an occupation and as escalation. According to classic Protestant resistance theory going back to John Calvin, lower magistrates, in this case colony governments, were expected to protect their people by resisting tyranny. And in this case, as they saw it, the most basic English right, the right not to be taxed without your consent, was at stake. When British troops attempted to seize guns and ammunition, which the right to possess guns and ammunition was also seen as a basic colonial right, colonial militia stepped in to defend it at Lexington and Concord, and the war began. At first, it was simply a war in defense of colonists possessing the rights of Englishmen. Loyalists, those loyal to Britain, appealed to passages like Romans 13 to condemn the revolution, while rebels placed such passages in the context of resistance theory, Protestant resistance theory, arguing that the Bible could not be used to defend tyrannical rule. They emphasized the great value Scripture places on liberty and the need to defend it. For example, they pointed to Israel's deliverance from slavery in the Exodus, or to Paul's exhortation to slaves, or to Christians not to be slaves of men, since Christ has given us liberty. They also increasingly used anti-Catholic rhetoric, applying it to Britain by virtue of the Quebec Act and other aspects of the English Church. It's probably no surprise that Scottish Presbyterians and English Puritans in the colonies played very prominent roles in the Revolution, in part because of their older or their long-standing tradition of resistance to English tyranny. Princeton University, the college of the Presbyterians, was seen as a hotbed of revolution. Its president became one of the founding fathers, John Witherspoon. He was a famous Scottish theologian. And one of its students was James Madison. In this image, you can see the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But this did not happen at first. As I said, the colonies originally saw themselves as fighting for the rights of Englishmen. But when the king refused to back down and rejected their further petitions, it radicalized the opinions of rebels. And many began arguing that it was in the best interests of the colonies to be independent from Britain. So the colonies' representatives gathering in a Continental Congress asked Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, among others, to write a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was a deist, an Enlightenment deist, but he and the committee used language that would appeal across the spectrum from the language of Protestant orthodoxy, but also the language of the moderate Enlightenment. So not so much Jean-Jacques Rousseau style Enlightenment with its radicalism, but a more John Locke type Enlightenment with its moderate Christian doctrines. And this, by the way, is Jefferson presenting the Declaration of Independence. But when you read the opening paragraphs of the Declaration, you hear this language that sounds to us like Enlightenment religious language, but you have to realize it was the same kind of language that Orthodox Protestants also used, the same kind of language as appeared, for instance, in the Westminster Confession of Faith. So it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can see, and we could continue reading, of course, but you can see already the religious language here that, and the political ideas that echo John Locke, but that all, and others like him, but that also clearly have their roots and commonalities with typical Christian language, such as the language of divine providence, or the laws of nature and nature's God, the language of a creator and a supreme judge. This was all typical Orthodox Christian language. And so what the Declaration is doing here is it is using kind of a public rhetoric that was acceptable to both Enlightenment and Orthodox Protestant people. The reality was that Reformed Protestants and deists shared common elements of belief. They shared beliefs in natural law and the role of reason. They agreed that humans possess natural rights derived from God, They agreed on theories of legitimate resistance to tyranny, and they agreed on the emphasis on consent and the rule of law. They also shared a belief that religion was essential for virtue, and that virtue was essential for liberty. For they agreed, if the government doesn't regulate people, if the government's going to give people freedom, they're going to have to regulate themselves. And thus, for that to happen, they need religion. At least, it doesn't necessarily have to be a completely orthodox religion, but at least religion that promises that God will judge people based on their behavior. Rewards for those who do good, punishments for those who do evil. The founders, whether Orthodox or Enlightenment, agreed, therefore, that religion was essential to Republican government and that government had to support it. And you can see this in the work of the Continental Congress through the war. Congress regularly called for days of prayer, and it used covenant theology to do so, calling the people to repent of their sins in order that God would favor their cause. Congressional leaders and troops alike attended worship services and employed chaplains. Congress actually endorsed a Bible translation for the American people. It promoted missionary work among the natives of the Northwest Territory. Most states still had an established church, and all states had religious tests, religious beliefs they required men to hold if they were going to hold office in those colonies or states. This picture here shows the British finally surrendering to George Washington at Yorktown at the end of the war. Now, when the war came to a close, there was increasing attempts in Virginia, as well as other colonies, but especially Virginia, where there was still a state church that actively suppressed religious dissenters. There was growing resistance to such state churches. In Virginia, dissenters, especially Baptists and Presbyterians, faced active harassment and imprisonment at this time. And their plight won them sympathy from leading liberal thinkers, political liberal thinkers, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So evangelicals and liberals formed an alliance led by Jefferson and Madison, who argued that religious liberty was a natural right and a duty of Christian charity. They also argued that religion would actually thrive better if left free and if forced to rely on the power of persuasion rather than the power of the state. 3 years after the war ended, Madison, Jefferson, and the evangelicals won their struggle for religious liberty in 1786. They passed a religious liberty statute that became a model for all the colonies. So Virginia went overnight from being the least tolerant colony to the most tolerant colony. And this shift had a big impact on the debates over the Constitution of the United States in the years after the Revolution. Many colonists still supported the idea of a state church, but it would have been impossible for the United States to establish a state church, or a national church, I should say, a federal church, because different colonies had different state churches. The New England colonies, or the New England states, now they're states, no longer colonies, but the New England states had Puritan Congregationalist state churches, whereas the southern states still had Anglican, or now that they were separate from Britain, Episcopalian state churches. And the middle states were mixed, some of them not having state churches at all. So the question is, what was the United States going to do? Well, this led to the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed, on the one hand, religious liberty, and on the other hand, prohibited Congress from establishing a federal church. However, what people today often don't realize is that the First Amendment left state churches in place. It left it up to each state whether or not it wanted to have a state church and what that state church would be. As the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. No, there's nothing here about states not making a law respecting an establishment of religion. And there's certainly nothing about a separation of church and religion. Christianity would continue to inform the laws of the land, and several states would still have established churches for decades after the American Revolution, although the middle colonies and the southern colonies relatively quickly did disestablish their state churches. New England kept their state churches for some time. Let me note a couple of points in conclusion on the American Revolution. First, the American Revolution was a fundamentally conservative revolution compared to the ones that would come later. It left property rights, including slavery, in place. It left the local colonial authorities in place and the laws that they had passed, simply turning them into state governments and state laws. Second, however, the rhetoric of rights and of liberty and equality that was unleashed in the Revolution, including in the Declaration of Independence and in the battles for religious freedom, would take on a life of their own in the following years. They would have a power on their own that would be difficult to control. Third, many people, including Thomas Jefferson, who was both the author of the Declaration of Independence, declaring all men equal, but was also a slaveholder from Virginia. Many such men grasped the contradiction between the founding principles of the Declaration and the institution of slavery. But they had trouble seeing how to get out of that. They didn't think it would be possible to free so many slaves overnight for various reasons that we'll talk about later. So the question was, and of course at this time there was slavery in pretty much all of the 13 states. For some people, white supremacy, the idea that whites or Europeans were superior to Africans culturally and civilizationally and religiously, was sufficient to justify the contradiction. But others, including Jefferson himself, assumed that slavery was contradictory to the American experiment and would gradually disappear. We'll return to those points later. It wasn't long after the American Revolution that a much more radical revolution broke out in France. The French and Indian Wars, which cost France its North American empire, and then the American Revolution, in which France had intervened on the side of the colonies in order to weaken Britain, had led France to bankruptcy. And poor harvests led to famine. In desperate straits, King Louis XVI assembled the Estates General in 1789. This was supposed to be representative of leadership across France to solve basic problems, but it had not met for a century and a half, and so there was little precedent for how it should be run. And it struggled to develop a fair voting procedure. There were supposed to be three groups: the clergy, the nobility, and what was known as the Third Estate, which was sort of the emerging middle class. But the middle class knew that it would consistently be outvoted by, basically the idea was that each of those three groups would get one vote. But the middle class knew that it would always be outvoted by the nobility and the clergy, the more traditional groups. And so it refused to abide by that principle of government, and the middle class representatives ended up breaking free and declaring themselves a national assembly. In it, they passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, sort of like the French analogy to the Declaration of Independence. It was a defining moment of the Revolution, a defining moment of the Enlightenment, and it, much more than the Declaration of Independence, conveys a thoroughgoing Enlightenment philosophy. It doesn't have the same religious or Christian rhetoric that the Declaration of Independence had. It laid out a much more systematic doctrine of rights, and it did so in a way that said nothing about duties. When you read through the Declaration of Rights of Man, you probably saw some things that were encouraging, things that you take for granted that are good contributions of the Enlightenment to law and the nature of rights. But maybe you read other things that seemed a little bit more troubling, maybe slightly exaggerated or rationalistic in ways that would undermine certain historic Christian or Western values. The National Assembly tried to launch a conservative reform. It tried to create, for instance, a national Catholic Church in which the Catholic Church would be governed by France and not by the papacy. In the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which the National Assembly passed in 1790, it legislated that bishops, Catholic bishops, should be elected by the entire male population. It then confiscated church lands, which you should hear echoes of that, of what Henry VIII had done in the early Reformation. And it required all clergy to take an oath of obedience. About half the Catholic clergy refused to do so, and they were often supported by their congregations. So in 1791, defending his control over his church, the Pope condemned the National Assembly's civil constitution. And now you have the Catholic Church pit strongly against revolutionary secular France. The king, a devout Catholic, tried to flee the country, but he was captured and imprisoned. By 1792, Republican France was at war with the Holy Roman Empire, a war that would expand to consume most of Europe over the next few years. Rebellions broke out throughout France on behalf of the king and Catholicism. Much of the French population did not support the revolution and its increasingly radical measures. The revolutionary state attempted to crush these rebellions ruthlessly, and the war became an excuse for large-scale executions of nobility, of priests, and of the entire royal family by beheading on the guillotine. And throughout the country, many who resisted the revolution or defended the Catholic Church or traditional prerogatives of the nobility or the monarchy were massacred. You can see here the classic painting that represents the French Revolution in its libertinism and its radicalism, with the tricolor flag there being held up by Lady Liberty. And in this next image, you can see the guillotine, the famous instrument of death for so many thousands of French people who opposed the revolution. As the revolutionary government struggled to fend off these threats, both from other countries who were hostile to the revolution and from those inside the country, the government became increasingly unstable, where one revolutionary regime gave way to another, and each one seemed more radical than the one that came before, to the point that, today's revolutionaries became tomorrow's conservatives, and people who were pushing the revolutionary cause one year, only a few years later, themselves found themselves guillotined or executed for being overly conservative or reactionary. Finally, the Jacobins, who were the most extreme revolutionary group, established a virtual dictatorship amid a reign of terror. They condemned Christianity wholesale, along with the whole old way of life, which they called the Ancien Regime, and included feudal power structures, included Christian laws and ideas, and many other traditional aspects of life. They tried to rationalize the government, wiping out traditional authorities, traditional regional boundaries, traditional measuring systems. This is where we got the metric system from. They even tried to eliminate the traditional 7-day week. They established an Enlightenment religion devoted to the celebration of the goddess Reason, much like Jean-Jacques Rousseau had hoped for. And they launched a process of de-Christianization, often accompanied by violence and vandalism. And so, very different from the American Revolution, the French Revolution came to represent extremism, radicalism, overturning all society and a rejection of Christianity. By the 1790s, people yearned for order and tradition, stability. And in that context, it became inevitable that somebody would try to seize control and restore order. And that person was Napoleon Bonaparte, an officer, a very successful military officer who seized control in 1799. He established a dictatorship, but he was enormously popular. And in certain ways, he did restore traditional order. In 1801, he signed a concordat, or agreement, with the Pope, Pope Pius VII, restoring the Catholic Church in the life of France and giving the Pope even more authority in it than he had had before the Revolution. In 1804, the Pope came to Paris to be present for the crowning of Napoleon as emperor. And so the Roman Catholic Church cemented an alliance with Napoleon and showed itself eager to ally itself with any political authority that would prevent revolutionary chaos. On the other hand, in certain other ways, Napoleon actually embraced some of the ideals of the Enlightenment and the Revolution. He fostered a surge in nationalism, exalting the French language and French culture and the power of a centralized state. And he continued to spout the rhetoric, revolutionary rhetoric of liberty and equality and fraternity. And he created a massive citizen army to defend France from its anti-revolutionary enemies. And that army ended up conquering much of Europe, as you can see in this map, all the areas that France either conquered or managed to secure as allies. And then some of the arrows show some of Napoleon's more aggressive campaigns into Egypt and all the way to Moscow. These wars, again, were rooted in the wars that broke out during the Revolution, where the various powers of Europe, who were alarmed at the revolution in France and alarmed that it might overthrow their governments too, they kind of turned against France, and that led to a series of wars that Napoleon turned into wars of French conquest. And they lasted all the way until 1815. As French armies overran most of Europe, they carried many of the revolution's ideas and imposed them on other countries. Napoleon seized papal territories in Italy. In the Holy Roman Empire, all ecclesiastical territories that had been long ruled by the church were seized and turned over to secular authorities. Large amounts of church property were confiscated. The Holy Roman Empire itself ceased to exist in 1806 when its emperor, Francis, retitled himself the Emperor of Austria. So from this point, Germany is basically a divided collection of states. Napoleon was finally defeated by a coalition of countries in 1815, and this led to the reestablishment of the monarchy. But the rabbit was out of the hat, so to speak, and revolutionary ideas had a power far beyond the French Revolution itself, far beyond Napoleon, and would continue, the struggle between revolution and anti-revolution would continue to define Europe for many, many years to come. Tensions between liberals and conservatives, between secularists and Catholics, endured. And in France itself, there would be further revolutions in 1830 and 1848, and France became known for its instability as one regime followed another, going from monarchy to republic to monarchy to empire to monarchy and so forth. So let me note a few key points finally about the French Revolution. First of all, unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution pit the Enlightenment and republicanism or liberalism on the one hand against Christianity and traditionalism on the other. And the Catholic Church, because it was under attack, sided decisively with traditional authorities. The Catholic Church itself was a traditional feudal authority in many ways. And so the lines in Europe were drawn between, on the one hand, what we might call the right, conservatives, the nobility, monarchs, and the Roman Catholic Church. And on the other hand, the left, liberals, and France, and secularism and republicanism. These terms, right and left, actually come from the French Revolution. The right was the more conservative wing of the National Assembly, and the left was the more liberal view of the National Assembly. And this sort of contrast between Christianity on the one side and liberalism, political liberalism on the other side, is starkly different from America, where Christianity and liberalism were seen as marching hand in hand. Another difference is that the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, arguably failed. It failed to establish stable democratic government, ultimately leading to dictatorship and war, and after that, the reestablishment of the monarchy. Very different from the American Revolution, which was wildly successful. The French Revolution also produced a surge of nationalism across Europe. The revolution itself fostered French nationalism, but as it was exported to other countries, it unleashed similar forces in those contexts. And increasingly, nationalism replaced religion as the primary emotional allegiance for many people. Regions like Germany and Italy and Belgium, which did not have national states, they were all divided or occupied, began to develop strong national identities and clamor for the establishment of national states, while at the same time turning against traditional structures of the Ancien regime, as France had done. And the rising middle class demanded more participation in government, appealing to the rhetoric of liberalism or republicanism against monarchies and against the landed nobility. And the struggle over these values would continue through the decades in Europe, exploding, for instance, in a series of revolutions across Europe in 1848. And Americans would watch across the Atlantic, and they would be terrified and horrified at the extremes that they were seeing in Europe. And it gave them great reason to be confident in what they already then saw as a kind of American exceptionalism in terms of the values of the American Revolution and the American Republican experiment. But Europe was tumultuous, but an even worse state of affairs emerged in Latin America, which was also consumed by revolutions in the years following the French Revolution. When French armies occupied Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, the ideals of the French Revolution were exported to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Here there was a sharp divide between the Peninsulares, who were recent European immigrants, and the Criollos, who were descendants of earlier generations of immigrants. The Criollos had established themselves in the Americas, in Latin America, as a wealthy class that exploited natives and exploited African slaves. And they resented European control, and they certainly represented the newer immigrants, or the Peninsulares. When France was defeated and the Spanish monarchy was restored, Spain tried to reestablish the level of control it had over its colonies before. And this provoked revolutions across Latin America. Brazil also broke away from Portugal, although the process there was more peaceful. In Haiti, which had been a French colony, African slaves rebelled against France in the name of the values of the French Revolution. This led to a brutal war, but Haiti won its independence. In fact, every Latin American country won its independence except Cuba and Puerto Rico. This is an image of the revolution in Haiti. Notice the Haiti was the majority of the Haitian population was slaves, African slaves, and here they are dressed in French military uniforms, fighting against their white opponents, who are also French. But here too, this was seen as sort of, many Americans saw this, and we'll talk about this more later, but they saw this as the chaos that the French Revolution had spawned, and the specter of a slave insurrection, like what happened in Haiti, as well as a slave republic, like what was a former slave republic, African Republic, that was established in Haiti was seen as a great threat to American slaveholders. This next image shows the massive sea change in just 30 years. Look at Latin America in 1800. The green are all Spanish colonies, and the yellow are the Portuguese colony of Brazil. Look at by 1830, all the purple countries are now independent. In just 30 years, they've cast off the rule of Spain and Portugal and are attempting to establish independent republics. And you'll see the only exceptions there are Cuba and Puerto Rico. Haiti at this point is still struggling for its ultimate independence. In these Latin American revolutions, Catholicism had a difficult position. On the one hand, priests on the ground played prominent roles in revolutionary movements, and they often appealed to Catholicism as a rallying point for those movements. For example, thousands of Mexicans marched on Mexico City carrying a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, that great symbol of Mexican Catholicism. On the other hand, the church hierarchy and the papacy strongly opposed and denounced the revolutions, viewing them through the same lens as the French Revolution. The papacy eventually recognized that if it wanted to maintain influence in Latin America, it would have to recognize the new republics, but there was constant tension and conflict. As in Europe, there was a sharp divide between liberals who supported the Republican movements and conservatives who supported the traditional regimes. Liberals included merchants and intellectuals and typically advocated written constitutions, basic human liberties, and individualism. They called for an American-style decentralized or federal government with checks and balances. And they called the government to leave markets as free as possible, following Adam Smith's free market economics, or using the French term laissez-faire, or hands-off, arguing that this approach would ultimately bring the most economic progress for everyone. These liberals were wary of the church because the church owned so much land. It was itself a traditional power. They thought it controlled too much of social life, too much wealth. And they wanted the church to limit itself to spiritual matters and leave temporal matters to the state. So, as in France, liberalism in Latin America went in the direction of secularism. And liberal regimes seized control of church property, including missions and schools. They abolished the compulsory tithe, or 10% tax, and they banned priests from participating in politics. In response, conservatives, who included land-holding elites and church leaders, advocated a strong centralized government bolstered by traditional authority structures. They viewed the church as a moderating and controlling social power, essential to order. And they viewed the upper classes as the appropriate leaders of society. Democracy here being seen as a radical idea, whereas the upper classes are seen as the more virtuous, who ought to rule. Unlike in the United States, but like in France, these Latin American revolutions did not produce stability, let alone democracy. Rather, they provoked chaos, social disorder, and civil war. For example, Mexico had 35 regime changes between 1822 and 1855. That's far more chaotic than even France endured. The elites, desperate for stability, turned to strong leaders known as caudillos to establish law and order. And such men established dictatorships across Latin America. And then often those dictatorships acted with great violence and repression. So let me conclude with a few key points. First of all, revolution in Latin America, like in France, did not produce democracy. And Latin American countries, although they were independent, they did win their independence from Spain and Portugal. They did not enjoy near the level of freedom or prosperity that the United States did. Secondly, drastic inequality, exploitation, and repression remained widespread in Latin America. Now, of course, that was true to a certain extent in America too. America had slavery. America had significant gap between the wealthy and the poor, but nothing like what you had in Latin America. In America, the middle class was growing constantly. And among whites, there was a significant degree of equality. But in Latin America, the situation was drastic. And finally, this is a key point just to remember through all of this. In France and Latin America, the church was hostile to, was pit against liberalism, freedom, and democracy. Whereas in the United States, the church was seen as, or Christianity at least, was seen as friendly to freedom and democracy. Now remember, in Latin America and France, the church is Catholic, whereas in the United States, most churches are Protestant. So this reinforced the Protestant mindset that Protestantism goes hand in hand with liberty, and Catholicism goes hand in hand with tyranny. And even in the United States, Catholics were not seen as being particularly friendly to liberty and equality and democracy and so forth. So these are, major political events in America, in Latin America, and in France and Europe. But they're also fundamentally religious events in many ways that have profound effects on churches, on the way people perceive Christianity, and on Christianity's social role moving forward.